All right, welcome everybody back to the latest episode of the Big Douglas Show. It is another Inside the Command Center episode on Friday where we try to get you as close to the organization as we can. Today we have Craig Hoffman on. Craig, how are you?
I'm great, Douglas. I'm excited to do this, man. I used to be a little bit closer when I was on the beat. Now I just yell about it from the outside, but I guess I know a thing or two.
There are two ways to get the job done. Both of them work, I think. It's interesting, Craig. You were on the radio for a while and then took some time off to do
hmm
the Spirit, if I'm not
Yep.
mistaken.
Yep.
What went into that decision, and how'd you like your time doing it?
Yeah, I mean it was multifactorial. One was just some exhaustion of being on the beat. You do the same thing every day for 3 years. Like I have so much admiration for John Keim, who's been doing it for a quarter century, especially considering the exhaustion that is covering this particular franchise.
Yep.
I'm certainly reminded of that being involved and talking about it every day this year. How exhausting it can be, how futile it can feel. And as a reporter, you try to separate yourself from that. But there's only so much you can. Like you're covering the news, and the news is the news of what it's been since forever. It seems since Snyder owned the team. And so that was definitely a part of it. And then I got a chance to meet some people involved in the Spirit at the time, and just I felt an energy that was an organization that was going in a direction that I felt like I wanted to help share their stories. The players in particular I got to meet at the time. I got to know Steve Baldwin a little bit, the owner at the time. The more I got to know Steve, as the world now knows, the less I was impressed. At that point, I was already in the organization. And obviously he was a part of some pretty bad stuff that happened there. While I was there, luckily, I wasn't involved in that stuff, obviously, but tried to support the players through it. And so it was a very interesting year at the Spirit because of a lot of the stuff that didn't wind up coming out till later. But just trying to be there and supporting the players and not to I'm not trying to toot my own horn or really, absolve myself of anything. But at the end of the day, having conversations in the aftermath with a lot of players saying no, you helped me, or you were there as a voice to, someone I knew I could trust and talk to, that was meaningful. I wouldn't say it was always the best time, but it was certainly interesting. And the one thing I think would be really interesting to this audience is understanding how a team works internally, the dynamics and what it's like to be on the inside of an organization versus the outside is perspective that I will take with me the rest of my career. I doubt I will ever work for a team again. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but that versus being a reporter on the outside is a very different thing. That is perspective that I think helps me do the job that I have now versus, if I had just gone straight from reporter to talk show host.
Do you have a soccer background?
Not really, not really. I've always liked the game as a fan. I played
Yeah.
till I was 8, as most kids my age did. But I've always appreciated it, and I've always had a really great appreciation for women's sports as well. I went to college at Middle Tennessee State first before transferring to Syracuse, and at MTSU, the women's basketball program was a huge deal. In fact, you could argue it's bigger than the men's. And at the time, Alicia Clark, who's one of my great friends and spent the last couple of years with the Washington Mystics, was there as well. So I've known Alicia for a decade, which is hilarious because now my wife and I are best friends. We hang out all the time. But thinking back then, Alicia was the nation's leading scorer and going to those games and growing that appreciation. Then at Syracuse, I called a lot of women's basketball games and was doing coverage of them, and women's lacrosse, who was very, very good when I was there. And so that it kind of started there. And then soccer is just always something I've kind of enjoyed. And wound up meeting some players through some interviews and stuff, and just was super impressed with them as people. And was there's stories here, I want to tell them. And that's kind of ultimately what drove me to do that.
You got the afternoon gig now that you're doing weekdays 3 to 6 on the Team 980. You've also got the Take Command podcast with Logan Paulson. How did the podcast come about?
Our company, Odyssey, our parent company, decided that they were going to start this division internally, 2400 Sports, and launch podcasts. I mean, the ultimate goal is kind of to build a network, right? Similar to, I guess, what, I doubt that the company would love me being yeah, we're trying to be like this other company. But in terms of similarities,
Sure.
Locked On is a great network of podcasts where they kind of have every sport and every team covered. And I think that's ultimately the goal. Obviously, we started with NFL. We started with a small number, as 10, 12 shows, and we were one of the first ones. And Logan and I had a great rapport from doing the doing the pregame show last year, and always were kind of, and it's funny because I had actually pitched a podcast to my boss, Chris Keinerd, saying like, hey, do you think Logan and I could do a podcast that like got into a lot more depth on some of the things that we never got to talk about because we only did a pregame show? And this is before I had the afternoon gig. And he was like, let me think about it. And then within probably a couple of weeks, he's like, actually, the company's starting to do them. And what do you think about doing it with Logan? I was like, yeah, done. Cool. And so getting the chance to do a show with Logan, like, and frankly, Doug, like radio's cool. It obviously is a full-time job. It pays the bills and I enjoy doing it. It's a hell of a lot better than a lot of jobs that you can have. It beats laying brick. It beats a lot of stuff. All due respect to folks that are doing that. You're working hard. That's kind of my point. I get to talk into microphones. Not that it doesn't take talent or skill or hard work, but it's a different kind of hard work. And so but I've always actually been super fond of the podcast format. I like it a lot better because it's if there's 5 minutes of material, you do a 5-minute podcast. If there's 3 hours of material, you do a 3-hour podcast. 3 to 6 every day. I got 3 hours, whether I got 5 minutes or 3 hours. And so the ability to kind of get some depth and dive into things without the time constraints of radio, especially with someone with Logan's mind, is like, that's such an amazing opportunity for me to be able to flesh stuff out and learn, frankly. Like I've become so much smarter about football. You know, I covered the team for 5 years and I knew a decent amount and got to learn a lot, but the stuff that I've learned in the last year of how game plans come together and all this kind of stuff from Logan, can't beat it. Can't beat it at all.
He's a super bright guy, and we're fortunate to have Chris Baker on this show every Monday. And there's just some things you can't. It's different when you're talking to the guys that have been in that locker room and spent their lives figuring it out and the nuance and all the different stuff. And it's really important. Speaking for myself, where a guy, to be able to get that kind of insight, it's impossible to do it without guys that have been in that locker room.
No, and I think, Doug, the thing that's super, like, there's this phrase, you don't know what you don't know. And it is covering the NFL and covering football at a high level is an ultimate exercise in you don't know what you don't know. You know, we can all play Madden and understand some basic play calls, right? Or we can watch the game for 2, 3, 4, 5 decades and feel like we've learned a lot from the people calling it on TV. And, you can even understand some next level stuff, some basic coverage structures. You might learn a play or two offensively over the course of time. But when you start watching all 22 down in, down out, and for me, that process started with Cooley, working at 980 the first time around, and was able to continue to grow with good relationships with Sean McVay and Kevin O'Connell and, Will Compton and certain Chris Thompson. These are guys that taught me a ton about football. They would take the time, because for me as a beat guy, I always wanted to be right. Like, and right with the information, my predictions, my opinion, like, who cares? I wanted to put out there correct information. And once you kind of get that reputation and earn that respect, if you come to a guy in a locker room with a play and you're like, what happened here? I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus. I'm just trying to give an accurate evaluation of what happened. They will help you out a little bit and point you in the right direction. And so getting to learn what I should even be looking for in the first place, getting to learn some of the nuances, and also learning that sometimes unless you ask that player, you'll never know, because the call may have been X and then there was a check that the coach didn't even know about at the line of scrimmage that changed it to something else. And it's very much not obvious. And, since we are in this long-winded podcast format, I'll give you an example. There was a play, 2017, 2018, whatever year it was that Swearinger was here, that it looked like Mason Foster got toasted by a running back. And the play call was a 3-over-2 situation where they had 3 guys to cover 2. Everyone had a man-to-man assignment. And if your guy stayed in to protect, you blitzed, green dog blitz, right?
Okay. Yep.
And so what happened was DJ's guy went out on a route. Mason's guy stayed. Mason started to blitz, saw that DJ apparently didn't care and blitzed himself. And Mason was like, oh, well, I guess I got to go cover his guy now. And so obviously he was late, but he was covering for his teammate. And so you learn these little things by reporting on specific plays. But then you also, I think the thing that's been so brilliant about working with Logan is you kind of learn how the plan comes together. Logan's a guy who sees very much big picture. He obviously was, touted around the NFL by Kyle Shanahan for a lot of years to a lot of different teams. And Kyle's as good as it gets at that kind of stuff. And so I think we have a great mix. And what I enjoy kind of, sparring with Logan occasionally is, some of the human nature, coaching, learning styles, teaching stuff that I also take, frankly, from my other career as a fitness professional, as a trainer. which is coaching and which is teaching, and then mixing that with the football knowledge and asking questions of, yeah, okay, so that worked on paper, but why didn't it work with the Jimmies and Joes on the field, if you will, the X's and O's, the Jimmies and Joes? Yep. How much more cliche can I get? Good God. But like learning that stuff and how that all mixes is what makes football great to me, and why it's so like such a fascinating game to analyze. And working with Logan has deepened my understanding of that in an incredible way.
Craig, we can never get on the field before we discuss the off the field. I mean, is this thing with Snyder, does it make you excited? You think he's going to pull the rug out of us and say, just kidding? I mean, sounds like it's a complete sale. I don't know who would be willing to pony up $1 billion for no say-so to work under Dan. So It feels like it's a all or nothing deal. Are you more excited now than you've been in the past? Because I'm sure you're like me in the past. We, not to hear about it because we didn't believe it. Do you believe it now?
I do. And it's just at this point seems inevitable. Like there was a point a couple of months ago with some of this stuff where I just felt, and the ESPN story was the ultimate, like fastest speed of the rolling downhill, but it just felt like it was rolling downhill towards something. And I didn't know what the something was at the time. And I certainly didn't anticipate, 10 days later that they would announce they've hired Bank of America to explore a sale.
It was fast.
It was real fast. But it felt like it was headed towards something. And there's just certain moments in your career as a journalist and as a sports host, whatever I am now. I'm definitely not doing journalism now between 3 and 6. But during your time.
And by the way, not enough people realize the difference, right?
Well, I mean, I guess I try to do opinion journalism, right? Like with small sidebar, like I still try to have some integrity in what we do. But it's certainly not hardcore reporting, right? It's not capital J journalism, but opinion journalism still should have some responsibility to the truth.
That's true.
Which, maybe some other people don't understand either, but hey, let's have a hot take. But in terms of Snyder, it reminded me of, and I'm trying to think of like what the other examples are. They're certainly much smaller, like player personnel decisions even, where it's like, oh yeah, if that keeps going in this direction, that guy's going to get benched or that guy's going to have to start or whatever. It's that feeling, but on a, 10-fold, 100-fold scale. And I think it just, there had to be some kind of resolution. There was no longer a way for Goodell and the other owners to bury their heads in the sand. And once you got to that point, something was going to happen. The fact that it's something this quickly is amazing. But I definitely think, like you said, no one's spending $1 billion to be second in command to Snyder. Basically, you're spending $1 billion on really expensive seats. Like that's right. You don't have any power. You don't have any say. I think the quote unquote worst case scenario, the way we're stuck with Dan the longest, is if somebody does that with a path that, hey, in 4 years, then you get to finish the buyout, which is kind of how Leonsis bought out Abe Pollin, if I'm remembering correctly, with the Wizards.
That's right.
And so that's a way where Dan could be around for a little bit longer. But it does certainly sound like he was kind of told, whether it was Jerry Jones or another owner or another group of owners, like, buddy, if you don't sell, we're going to throw you out of here. So you might as well get lost and we don't have to vote you out, because nobody wants to, the owners don't want to set that precedent. It's so much easier when you get a Jerry Richardson situation.
It's arbor treatment.
Yeah. And so I think that is likely where we're headed. It sounds, based off all the reporting, that we'll be done with him by March, by the owners' meetings. And, I also happen to think that there's going to be more stuff that comes out. I think that there's it's not like Don Van Natta and Seth Wickersham and Tisha Thompson stopped working. It's not like other Mark Maskey at the Post is like, oh, great job, Don. I got nothing. Like Maskey and Liz Clark and Nikki Jabvala, like they're working too. And so there's always a chance that more stuff is going to come out. Eventually we'll get some level of congressional testimony. Who knows where these lawsuits go? Who knows what Maryland and Virginia are doing? So I just think the sooner he can get out, and that's better for not only him in some ways, where some of the stuff they might just be like, all right, well, that's good. We don't need to deal with this anymore. But I think for the NFL, obviously they are trying to push this as fast as possible. That way they can be like, yeah, not our problem anymore. See you, Danny boy.
Him and Elon Musk could teach a class together on how to take free money and just light it on fire. It's impossible to think what these two gentlemen have done with something that could have run itself.
No, and that's the thing, is like Dan bought in for what, $800 million?
Yeah.
And now he's going to make $7 billion on it. But it should be, whether it's 5.6, 6, 6.5, 7. Like, if that organization was mismanaged this badly and still worth that, he should be getting like 9 or 10. Like, imagine if this organization had a great stadium and a fan base. Well, one, he'd get to keep it,
Right.
potentially, if he had also behaved himself and hired non-terrible people along the way. But even if he did and managed the actual business side correctly, and still was forced to sell because of his behavior, like, he'd be getting more money. And that is wild. What Elon's doing with Twitter is incredible. At any point, he could have just stopped doing dumb stuff. Like with Elon, he's self-inflicting wounds in a way that is just remarkable. It's like, bravo, sir. I didn't think that was possible. Your circus tricks are highly entertaining, except for I guess good thing you messaged me before the thing burned down, so we can do this podcast.
That's right. Where is your next stop on the if Twitter's out, what's next then?
It's funny. I've actually been thinking about this.
TikTok, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I have a TikTok. I never use it. Maybe I'll have to start. Instagram I use actually more than Twitter anyway as like a user. And I've also been super active on YouTube recently. That's kind of my next frontier, in part, like, bluntly, because it's easier to monetize. And so hopefully I can cross that monetization threshold pretty soon and start doing more there. YouTube.com/@Craig Hoffman, shameless plug. But it is interesting too. Like,
a lot of people think it's getting 1,000 viewers. You got to get like 10,000 watch hours for it.
Right now, getting the watch hours has been easier. People seem to really like our podcast on YouTube, but I got to get the subscribers up. So if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my channel, please, Lord. But what in terms of like the daily job and as a user, like, it is kind of weird to think about, like, where do we go to get the practice updates, right? Like Nikki and Sam and John and Michael and all the folks on the beat, they do a great job of tweeting out information.
Yeah.
Like, did Chase Young practice today? I don't know. Let me check Twitter. Hey, we need to carry Ron's press conference live. Okay, cool. They're streaming it on Twitter. Like, we do have a pretty, centralized news source that's going to disappear. And it's going to be very interesting to see, like for John at ESPN, like, what does ESPN want him to do with those same pieces of information? Do they care? I don't know. What does the Post do with Sam and Nikki? Like, it's pretty fascinating to think about where that information could go, or does it just disappear and we all become dumber?
Yeah, because the sports and the fantasy world have kind of, sunk into Twitter and used it as like home base, if you will. So, I mean, if indeed it crumbles, there will have to be somebody that fills the void. I kind of think it is TikTok. I've seen more and more like podcasts using it just to put clips down. I find myself falling down rabbit holes all the time about ancient aliens and the use of nutrients and stuff. It's a fascinating place.
Yeah, no, TikTok is, I mean, during the pandemic, I was like, screw it. I'm just going to go on TikTok. Like, I have an hour left in my day. I'm just going to go on TikTok and kill it. And it became like a conscious choice. Now I have a wife, so I like speak to her and have a human interaction, which is very nice.
If you take the quarterback, just do away with quarterback, how talented is the roster right now?
Very. I mean, it's skill position wise, very. Defensively, I'd say it's pretty darn talented as well. A roster can be made or broken by the offensive line, and that is probably the weakest unit on the team. I think some folks would probably say linebacker, but like Jamin's playing pretty well these days.
Really well.
And it's also, in terms of importance, like linebacker might be the least most important position group in the modern NFL, where offensive line is one of the most important. You can be pretty untalented in other places like Tennessee, and you have a great offensive line and you go and thrash people and they're once again, somehow at the top of towards the top of the AFC. And it's like, I think I know how. Their offensive line's great and that they have a distinctive game plan, and that Henry fellow is pretty good too.
Not bad.
But I think skill position wise, they're extremely talented. Their wide receiver group is one of the best in the NFL. I think the running back group is pretty darn good. I think that, tight end is an underutilized position in this offense, but the individual players are fairly talented and have like that's a good room. Bates is such an excellent blocker. Thomas,
and they've been using that 31 personnel more recently now that they're getting healthy at tight end.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's something that I'm actually really fascinated by this weekend. Is Scott Turner's been so much better on extended rest. And last week was we had one extra day. Is that enough to find those deeper pages of the playbook now on 6 days rest, where you use the 13, you use the 22 personnel with 2 backs, 2 tight ends. Like, you use all these different personnel groupings to create good matchups, but they're able to deploy the different skill sets in a way that it's not only talent, it's well balanced talent. They have a skill set for every need. And it's just deploying it well that has become the challenge, and obviously the quarterback situation. And then defensively, like their line is sick, and James Smith-Williams and Casey Toohill deserve a ton of credit too. Like the 3 first-rounders, duh. But those guys have been fantastic. The secondary has really come together well. They've got talented players on the back end that once William Jackson was exited, has come together quite well. So yeah, I actually think the roster is. It's interesting because we've spent so much time bashing, I think, Rivera and the Martys, and I'm not saying they've put together a great team and they haven't really shown a propensity to, have kind of the balance of like need of like, the offensive line, like, hey, that's really important, or quarterback, like, what are we doing there? Although I think that's harder than people want to give it credit for.
And they've tried.
Yeah, and they've tried, but trying is only half the battle, obviously. But I do think that in a lot of those positions I just mentioned, they're pretty good, and that's probably the big reason why they're 5-5 and have climbed out of this hole.
I'll use that as a segue. You mentioned climbing out of the hole, Craig. Do you have a finger on why it takes Ron's teams so long to get going? That's not a this year thing. That's all 3 years he's been here. It's most of Carolina. It's a slow. The team is slow to get started. Now they tend to get rolling, but they're always climbing out of a hole. Do you have an idea? Your finger on why that is?
I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to say. I've been searching for a less harsh way to say this for months, if not years. I don't think he's that great of a head coach, and I certainly don't think Scott Turner's that good of an offensive coordinator, which is by an NFL standard. Those dudes would coach circles around me. I am by no means saying that I or you or anybody listening, unless like Jay Gruden is listening, could go out there and do a better job at offensive coordinator or head coach. Jay specifically for offensive coordinator, just to be clear, so we don't have people yipping in the comments. But like part of what makes someone good in that job is the ability to adapt quickly, to identify and adapt quickly. The speed at which things happen is the relative good or badness of a coach, or one of the main factors, right? How quickly can you make the adjustment? Because it's not like Ron doesn't know football, and it's not like Scott doesn't know football. If you sat down with Scott Turner, you would be blown away at how smart the guy is.
That's right.
The problem is, how quickly can he implement that knowledge, and how good of teachers are they? And it seems like they are not very good at the implementation and the teaching in a way that aligns with the timeline necessary to win games over the course of a 17-game schedule. If they had a 7-game preseason and then a 12-game schedule, they would be better. But that's not how this works. And so you're dealing with non-artificial timelines. It's not like, oh, well, let's just extend it. Like, no, week 1 starts when week 1 starts. And if you can't get the whether it's the technique, the scheme, whatever it is installed by week 1, and then 2 and 3 and 4, you're not going to have a good record in those weeks. And those weeks count. And I think that is the thing. Now, he has strengths in other areas specific to Ron. His ability to hold a team together, I've always marveled at, especially considering I think there's probably early in seasons when guys look at him like, is this dude any good? And he still somehow, engenders a belief. I think probably Terry and John Allen have a large role to play in that as leaders. But it is something that I think I've just thought for a while at this point is like sometimes the answer is the simplest. I don't think they're that good at their jobs, which is not to say that they're dumb, not to say that they're horrible at their jobs, not to say they're idiots, not to say anything bad about their work ethic or their character. It's really hard. And from a skill standpoint, the things you need to do as a head coach and offensive coordinator, I don't think Ron Rivera and Scott Turner respectively are like excellent at them.
And they must not be flexible, right? I mean, I think that's the other thing is it's like, no, you're going to learn to do it this way. We are going to do it this way. And we're going to look bad until you figure out because this is the way we do it. Now, that's not personally how I think things should be done, but that's really the only thing I could put my finger onto as to why it takes so long is because maybe it's complicated and they're not willing to dumb it down for anybody.
It's a great point. And it is a double-edged sword to like give Ron and Scott a little bit of credit here. Do you abandon ship too quickly, right? Like if you have a plan and you think it works and you just go all over the place and are constantly making massive adjustments and massive changes, you never get a chance to get continuity, which is also valuable. So I think they're actually, like, to your point, they are bad at balancing that. They are bad at managing flexibility and continuity. And they both tend to lean towards continuity in a way that's probably too far that direction and thus damaging. I do think there is something to, some stick-to-itiveness. And I think Ron is probably good on in terms of message. Like that actually plays well and is on the positive side of the ledger. But message and scheme are two very different things, and your ability to make the scheme adjustments and maximize your personnel shouldn't take that long. And also, like, I just think they have blind spots sometimes too, specifically for Scott. Like, why doesn't Curtis Samuel get 4 or 5 carries every week? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. Or why is it so hard sometimes to get Terry McLaurin the football? Like, when stuff works, sometimes coaches overthink this, and like this is something that I think I've seen in the NFL through multiple staffs now, is like sometimes you get a little too cute and a little too smart. And then sometimes you go the other way. Sometimes you're too tied to your identity and you don't do the obvious thing when there's a slight adjustment that can be made in your favor. And so that is to say, these jobs are very hard. And it's a lot easier for us to sit in front of microphones and criticize them. But at the end of the day, like, we're evaluating what we see based off our knowledge level. And it's not like we don't know nothing. And I do think that sometimes the value of being in our seats is we can see the forest through the trees. And I do think sometimes football people, and I will go back and forth about this with Logan sometimes on our show. And a lot of times he will go like, yeah, you might actually be right on that one, where he is, a guy that, like, when he played, it was very focused of like, how do I beat that defensive, or how do I block this guy? How do I get the angle on this linebacker? And like that detail oriented. And sometimes I'm just like, buddy, come back to me a little bit. There's a forest here. And he's like, oh, right, the forest. And sometimes I do think inside buildings around the NFL, and specifically inside this one, they're a little too focused on the trees.
That's why I've always said also that it feels like there should be somebody on the staff, on every staff, that is not like tied into football. It's just one of us, because we watch football games. And this, players and coaches watch clips and cut-ups because they're only interested in if a play works and how can I get back to that play to make it work. Whereas fans that watch a game from beginning to end, like, we have a better sense of like the way the game flow is going, like maybe when it's time to speed things up or slow things down, that I think people that are just football lifers don't have the same perspective on.
No, I actually brought this up. I feel like the last 2 games, definitely in the Philly game, we talked about this because, like, I obviously watch on TV, as does Logan, but then Logan will pretty immediately go back and watch the tape. And when you take out the crowd noise, you take out the commentary, and you're just watching silent all 22 footage, this used to happen to me when I watched a lot more tape when I was on the beat, and I would do like my Tape Tuesdays on Twitter and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes you're just like, wait, where am I in this game? What possession am I on? And especially like, for folks listening that are more into it and watch on Game Pass, the game is still in order. You don't have offense and defense. That's not how the pros watch film. The pros watch it offensive drive. Like, it's not like Scott Turner fast forwards through the defense. Like, his film is sorted. And digitally now it's very easy to do. He just watches the offense. And so it's one drive after another. And eventually and like the punts aren't even there. Eventually the drive, like, you're like, wait, what happened? Oh, it's the next drive. And now the ball's back at the -30. And so when you lose that feel, you can definitely lose some of that human element, some of that emotion. And so I asked Logan in the Philly game, when you watched it on film, who did you feel like won if you ignored the score? And he's like, Philly, Washington never really stopped them on defense. They didn't have a ton of explosive plays on offense. Philly did. And it just felt like Philly played better. But because of other factors, ball control, et cetera, that you lose perspective of when you watch the game on film, it's very easy to get caught up in that and evaluate the game that way. And sometimes that's why it's hard to make sense of a guy like Heineke, who has won a bunch of games despite poor performance, because the process doesn't seem like it's good, but there's little things within there that you can identify and say, well, those are the things that actually win and lose games. And he's been able to do just well enough in some of those areas. By the same token, the Minnesota game, that pick that he throws late in that game, or was it whatever game that he threw a late pick recently?
It was that Vikings game.
Yeah, it was the Vikings game, I guess, because it's the only one he's lost. Yeah, and I, at the time, was like, I don't like this play calling sequence. I don't like that they let him throw it here. I would have just pretty much eaten it and trusted my trust way to boot it down inside the 10 and my defense to hold up. And Logan's like, well, the play's designed. It worked there. It's the right read. I'm like, Yeah, but Logan, if you watch the game in context, if you watch it with the feel of it, you could feel that he was about to throw a pick. Taylor was starting to feel himself a little bit. It felt like it was teetering out of control. And at that point as a coach, I think it's the coach's job to be like, hey, buddy, get back. Like, you got to pull the reins on that wild stallion a little bit.
That's the play where he sails Logan Thomas by like 3 feet.
Right, exactly. And it just felt like that we're teetering on the edge of losing control. And yes, the play call in itself, when you say this offensive, this route concept works against this defense, he probably had an easier throw, but even Logan is open. Like, it's a good read. I'm like, yeah, but he's got to make the throw. And that is not what he was in a position to do at that point, because it felt like he was due for an interception. And if I can feel that from my couch, they should have tried to been able to feel that from the sideline or from the booth in Scott's case, now that he's moved back upstairs. And that's game management. Like, that's some of that human element stuff that enters far beyond scheme and route concepts and blitz packages and protections that, yes, is super important. I'm not saying that stuff should be just tossed aside for vibes, but you do have to have some feel as a coach. And I think that is an area where, the scheme and like what you should do on paper didn't match the feeling in the game. And obviously it was costly for the Commanders in that particular one.
We talked earlier that sounds like the team will get sold. I've heard of like in 6 months, that kind of time frame. If you go from the very first Bank of America statement, that can put you just before the draft, maybe in March. What do you think they do? I mean, I don't think that you can pull this team out. You know how off seasons work. I mean, these guys are planning now for the draft.
Right.
So it feels like everybody's going to get one more year, even with a new owner. How do you trust this group to draft a quarterback if they're in position to? I don't probably think they will. But as a new owner coming in, how do you tell this group, well, it's your draft, but I don't want you doing this, and this? How do you think it works out? Because I do think everybody's back at least one more year because of the timing of the ownership transfer.
Yeah, it's something I've thought about a lot, and there's not a satisfactory answer.
There is not.
No, there just isn't.
Yep.
I think if I was the new owner, which, to be very clear, Doug, I will not be. I do not have that kind of cash. I just, in case anyone was getting up their hopes, or perhaps on the other end of the spectrum, was very scared.
Breaking news here on the podcast
that it won't be me. But if I was an owner, I would have, like, now, as I prepare my bid and like prepare to potentially own this team, I would be eyeing some kind of president of football operations, someone who is going to ultimately outrank Rivera and help run my organization for the long term. And that person might wind up really liking Ron Rivera and keeping him around. And if Ron does a good job, like, fine. But that person also gets to help make those decisions. Ultimately, you have to trust your general manager. You have to trust, who's in place. And unfortunately, that is not the best of the NFL in Washington's front office. Quarterback scouting can be a bit luck. It can be a bit, it's super hit or miss. Obviously, unless you're drafting 1-1 overall, you are also dependent on other teams and what they do. Last year, I don't think a lot of people anticipated Kenny Pickett being an option for Washington because they figured, hey, a quarterback's got to go in the first half of the first round, right? And then nobody did, and Washington also passed. And so I think that there's too many factors right now, including, by the way, like, they might mess around and make the playoffs. Like, I don't think it's going to happen, but like mathematically, we've been speaking because they were in such a hole all year on our show, and I'm sure you've been doing the same here, about like, oh, well, is Rivera going to get fired? Is this? And it's like, no, they're 5-5 and a half game out of the playoffs. Like, your coach is probably not getting fired in that scenario, and definitely not getting fired with this ownership situation. So I think we do have to think a bit long-term, but it does create this horrendous conundrum if you are someone like me, and it sounds someone like you, who doesn't believe Ron's here for the long haul. That perhaps he's just actually,
history shows that a new owner is going to pick a new.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, history with Ron Rivera, like, it is Groundhog Day for Rivera with the Jerry Richardson situation all over again. And Tepper gave him a year and a half, basically. Like, he got like part of the way through the next year, I guess half a year. And so if that happens again, or Ron is let go after next season, which also is cheaper, by the way, because obviously he's got a pretty big contract. We don't know exactly the number, but if you're the president of football operations and the head coach, you're making a lot of money. And this owner is going to be spending $10 billion between a new stadium, the team, and a new practice facility. So I know at that point, like, $5 to $8 million ain't that much more, but it's still not nothing. I do think it puts you on this terrible path of coach and quarterback not on the same timeline, and whoever it is you bring in having kind of what Jay had, inheriting Robert. And that is probably not ideal. Hopefully whoever they draft is someone who does have a high upside, a high character, high football IQ, high all that stuff. And you can get a Brian Dable, Daniel Jones situation. Like, you hire the right guy and the quarterback has a skill set. Like, it doesn't have to end poorly. But I do think making sure, and this is something that I do think Ron and them are decently good at, is the character part of it. And so maybe you get a guy who at least is not, Robert's a good analyst. Like, he's a nice enough guy in my relationship with him. I never want to like just bash the guy, but like, sure. Robert had an interesting mental makeup. Let's put it that way for a franchise quarterback. He had his own, and he was an independent thinker, which is not exactly something that's going to vibe with every coach. And so if you get more of a Patrick Mahomes type mental makeup, more of a Josh Allen type mental makeup, someone, even a Daniel Jones. And again, we're talking about the mental side, not necessarily the physical side. Lamar, frankly, Lamar Jackson, he's been willing to learn and being willing to be coached. You get that kind of guy in here, it could work out. You get someone who's, and I don't know enough about the first round quarterbacks at this point to have any thoughts on who it could be. But like, you get someone who's a little bit more independent minded, a little bit more selfish, whatever, that could get ugly. And that then you're in this cycle again where you hope that 4 years down the road, we're not doing the same exact thing where they're looking to draft a quarterback on the verge of firing the coach. Like, those two things and the general manager need to be aligned. And hopefully, whether Ron's here for the long term or not, one, I have a hard time believing Scott's going to be here. Not impossible, but like, man, it's been rough. But between OC, head coach, quarterback, that there can be some alignment there.
Let's play a little game called Should They, Would You? Should they play Wentz again this year? Would you play Wentz again this year?
No and no, because either one of two things is going to happen. One, Taylor keeps winning and you're on the verge of the playoffs, in which case, why would you change your quarterback? Or two, you lose and you're not, in which case, why not take a look at Howell? And I was very anti that earlier this year. The kind of the first round of people calling for Howell, and they were like, why not? And I was like, because he's not ready. It's like, how do you know? Well, because he was the third quarterback, and third quarterbacks never take practice snaps. So he's been sitting there, running some scout team and otherwise just doing a lot of mental reps. And mental reps are helpful, but they're not as helpful as physical reps. And, Howell not only has been getting the 2 reps now, which typically about 20% of reps in a period. It's my understanding they've given him a little bit heavier workload, in part because Taylor knows the offense. So they've been able to get him 50% of the reps. So he's a lot more ready now than he was 4 or 5 weeks ago. So at that point, I'm just taking a look and seeing what I got and seeing if maybe he's someone who I at least let compete for the starting job next year. And that impacts my decision. Wentz, I've kind of seen enough. They might, and I don't think, I will put it this way though. I don't think it's unreasonable to potentially play him 1 or 2 more games to see if he learned anything while on the bench and has a better feel for the offense. But he just, the stuff you need to win in this offense, being able to make quick decisions, have a little bit of mobility, specifically areas of the field that he is bad in, aka over the middle. It's not a good match. It's not a good fit. I don't know what analytics Ron was looking at, but that sheet of paper should be balled up and thrown away. Whatever one he keeps bragging about. That when they brought
his numbers are actually better than Heineke. It's just the game doesn't flow the same way.
No, and the thing is, Heineke's really good at avoiding negative plays. And when you're going to run this, like, let's run a lot of plays, run the football, 3 yards in a cloud of dust, short, quick passing game, the big play that you might get that inflates your numbers doesn't really matter that much. And it's not like they're getting a ton of those anyway. And I'd rather have a consistent offense that also allows my defense to rest and John Allen and Deron Payne to play a higher percentage of snaps than, yeah, cool, we got a 1 yard or a 1 play 75-yard bomb to De'Ami Brown. All right, John, get back out there. Like, in some ways, that's not helpful. You'll take the points, but you'd rather have the consistency.
It's odd, too, because you mentioned it, and it's the saying 3 yards in a cloud of dust, but That is what is happening here. I mean, it's odd that they got a lot of yards rushing the ball, but it was not for, you like that 4.5. I think it was like 3.3 yards per carry last game. Is it sustainable? Can you win that way?
Yes, if you're efficient. I will say something Ron mentioned, and I think sometimes coaches get way out over their skis and some of the statistical stuff, but like this is actually a good point by Ron. They had a ton of 3rd and shorts because they were so efficient on 1st and 2nd down of getting like, you get 3.5 yards twice. Well, now you're 3rd and 3, or you get, a 5-yard completion plus a 3-yard run. Now you're 3rd and 2. Well, okay. A 2-yard run is now a success. It kills your average. But they had a ton of 3rd and 2s, 3rd and 1s, 4th and 1s. They had some carries at the goal line. The Robinson touchdown short. So it tends to bring, it brings your average down where it still wasn't going to be pretty. It's not like you take out all the short yardage stuff and they're averaging 4.5 a carry, but it would have been closer to 4 as opposed to the 3.2 or whatever it was. So I know there's some advanced statistic about success rate. I need to figure out. I think Football Outsiders has it, so I need to go dive into their website. But some of the folks that I follow were saying that their success rate last week was actually really high, even if their yards per carry was not.
Would you pay Payne this year?
Whew.
Assuming he wants, let's assume he wants the same $18 million a year that his buddy John Allen got.
I think that's a tough sell, but I'd give him close. I'd figure out a way to make it work. You just look at the way their defense plays and the statistics that those two put up together. It is the reason their defense is great. You then have to, like, the hard part is then, like, do you trade Sweat? Do you trade Chase? Like, that's the discussion we're having here. You can't pay all 4 of them. And forever,
unless you have a rookie quarterback. I mean, that's the only way
that's true.
You've got a guy on a rookie deal.
That is true. And the salary cap is going to continue to climb. It's going to be real hard to pay all 4 of them. I'll put it that way. And do you keep skimping at other positions? Like a guy like Holcomb, is he a free agent this year? I think he might be.
Yeah, but Holcomb was next on my list to ask about.
Yeah, and so, if you can sign him for super cheap and get some continuity, like, sure. If not, you go draft another rookie linebacker and you actually wind up paying, low money at that position and you're able to pay those guys. Yeah. I do think you try to kick the can down the road as far as you possibly can, and don't make anything crazy until you have to. But also, there is some responsibility sometimes of like doing something that's tough. I just think at this point, the way Payne has played, the incredible effect that he and Allen have together on the game, and also they're the rare. Both of them have this ability. I've actually talked about this a lot in the last 48 hours. The game has changed, right? Where teams have gone back to a lot more power runs because defensive linemen have gotten lighter because they've had to play all this zone stuff where they got to run all over the place.
In general, more safeties on
right. And then Logan's talked about this a lot on our podcast, so I'm not going to try to do it at the level Logan does. People want to listen to Take Command, become a lot smarter. That's how I learn this stuff. Is I'm like, yes, Logan, please teach me about football. But Vic Fangio was the first guy to kind of do this and say we're not going to be +1 in the run game. We're going to be -1 in the run game and +1 in coverage because teams are trying to throw the ball. Well, you can get away with that when you have big dudes inside who are super strong and mobile. Then you actually aren't at a deficiency in those areas despite your numbers. And Allen and Payne are 2 of the 10 guys in the league, let's say, who qualify for that. And if you can have them together, that's why they lead the league in a bunch of advanced rushing statistics. That's why they've been able to play the way they play. And to break that up is going to make your football team significantly worse, which sounds like a bad idea.
Yes, and when you start talking about money, I mean, the Bradley Chubb deal puts defensive ends at like $22 million.
Yeah.
So we were, I got Sweat here on my list of would you, because again, he's had a fantastic year this year, but are you more likely to hit on a premier DN picking him in round 1 and letting Sweat go for the $22 million he cost, and then giving Daron Payne the $18 million that he wants? Can you?
I think I would. Yeah, I think I would, and I really, really like Montez Sweat as a football player.
And I wouldn't have up until this year is odd.
I agree. No, I'm 100% with you, and even to the point of the trade deadline, like Standig and I, when Ben's on my show every Tuesday, we had this discussion for weeks leading up to the trade deadline when 1, they were bad, and 2, we didn't have quite the volume of evidence that like Payne has taken on yet another step. And we got to the trade deadline and we're like, hell no, you shouldn't trade that guy. He's incredible. And so the question like turned to, would you trade Sweat? And I don't think they should, because they're now in competition and it's not fair. Like, I do think there's an argument to be made that you kind of pull the plug early and be like, look, we're not a championship team, and like we're gonna moneyball this a little bit, or we're gonna quasi tank. But that's definitely not what they're doing. And what it's not like that's not in Rivera's DNA. And so I would consider it. I mean, I would consider Chase as well, depending on what happens the next couple of games. Like that's
it sounds
an
like
interesting
he's
one.
not ready for this week either.
Yeah, and so that's becoming a problem, in that you want to get a look at this guy and see what he looks like, but also like which one of those guys has the higher value moving forward. Also, which one is going to be harder to re-sign. Like, I don't know they're that different as players in terms of ultimate impact. They do it differently, so they're in a weird spot with that. I will say the one thing, let's give a ton of praise to James Smith-Williams and Casey Toohill, who are not going to ever be big money guys, but are bona fide starters. Like both of them, if they're one of your starting DNs, could you upgrade with a first rounder? Sure. Are you going to get excellent play opposite a first rounder? Yeah, you're not going to do much better. And those two guys have been awesome this year, which makes this like an interesting conversation where you can actually look at, okay, what if those guys were playing opposite of Chase or Montez, and then you trade the other one and you feel like you got a pretty freaking good, dominant even defensive line? Like, I think that's now the equation. I would keep Payne.
Yeah, it's interesting. And James Smith-Williams, I think, is interesting. I don't think a lot of people realize how high his spark score was. Like, he's a big, freaky athlete. I think just took some time to get used to the NFL game.
Yeah.
Let's do just a little bit on the game before we wrap this thing up. They're 2.5 point favorites. I find the line to be interesting. I mean, here they get through, whooping the best team in the league, or at least the last undefeated team in the league on Monday Night Football. And then they turn around and they were like, the Eagles were like 15-point favorites when they played Houston. We're 2.5. It smells funny. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're asking the wrong 980 host about smell. We all know Sheehan's got a trademark on the smell test, Doug. Don't get me in trouble now.
We will not steal from Kevin.
It is a stinky fish for sure. I think one, typically you get 3 points to be on the road. Sure. So that's maybe part of it. I don't know how hard of a place Houston is, but it's something. I also think the general bad vibes around this team tend to cause Vegas to pull it down a little bit. I think that's just like a general trend. And the same reason that they tend to inflate Cowboys lines a little bit, because you have a whole bunch of Cowboys fans all around the country that love to bet on their team. Right. And it's like, well, we can steal their money. Let's do it. So I think that there's a little bit of that going on as well. And then I think this team doesn't play a style that lends itself to blowouts. And then, the idea that it could be a trap game, I think is there. Are they better than Houston? Yeah. And stylistically, by the way, after taping our pod with Logan, which is out now, that came out this morning, like they should beat the tar out of Houston, because Houston is super weak on the interior of their offensive line. And what did we just talk about? Yep. How thoroughly dominant Allen and Payne have been. And they're not explosive, particularly offensively. So like Washington can just run the ball, and I don't even know that Houston's going to stop it. I had my buddy Landry Locker on from 610 Sports in Houston yesterday, and he said it's the worst front seven he's ever seen in the NFL. So
I had Sean Pendergast on from the same network, and he said the same thing. That the defensive line, you don't know who they are outside of Jerry Hughes. And,
right. They're
they
bad.
Should be primed to run on.
Yeah, by NFL standards. I always try to be kind enough to at least say, like, yeah, they'd go beat a high school team, a college team, they beat the tar out of. By NFL standards, they ain't very good. Yeah. And so, I think that when you look at that matchup, it makes a lot of sense that they'd win pretty handily. But Vegas, the guy that Lander and I used to work with in Dallas, Ian Fitzsimmons, who now does national radio for ESPN, has a great saying, which is they don't air condition the desert because they lose. And so I always look at lines like this that don't make a lot of sense with a very skeptical eye. I don't know exactly what we're missing. It seems like we are on the same page, that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. But I will not be surprised if the Commanders squeak out a win on a Joey Sly field goal and like barely cover, or that's enough for a 2-point win and Houston covers on Sunday. It's just how these things go.
Let's wrap it. Let's wrap it that way. What is the key to winning, and what do you think the score looks like?
Yeah, take advantage of the things that present themselves, right? Like Allen and Payne should have a monster day. Can they get some sacks and maybe even force a turnover or two that, whether it's a scoop and score and they directly score on defense or it's a short field and Heineke and company take advantage. I think that's the key to victory. And then just stay disciplined offensively. Don't try to force anything if you're Taylor. If you're Scott, stick to the stuff that works. Keep running Curtis. Keep getting Robinson his touches. Keep getting Gibson his touches. And then when you do go to the air, make sure a lot of those targets go to Terry. Like, don't overthink it is kind of the key to the game. You're a definitively better team for once. And so act like it and go out and handle business.
Yeah, it's surprising because the motion rate is like 22% on the season. And last game, they got it up to 44%, 45%. And why they aren't using motion at least 45% is beyond me. There's obvious gains and reasons why you do it. What do you think the score looks like, Craig?
Something like a 24-14, 24-17 game. I do think they ultimately cover it. And Houston will get a couple just because that's the NFL. Maybe a big play. Davis Mills is not a terrible quarterback, although he hasn't had a very good year. And Brandon Cooks has a propensity to get loose once a game. But at the end of the day, like, Washington should have their highest point total in a while, and defensively it should be pretty solid.
He's Craig Hoffman. You can catch him every day on the Team 980 from 3 to 6. And what days does the Take Command podcast come out, Craig?
So typically we're Monday, Wednesday, Friday. This past week was a little funky because of Monday Night Football, but Monday we publish it, like, we record the day before, publish it first thing in the morning. So if you're subscribed, you wake up, listen on your drive to work Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you're all set.
Buddy, I appreciate it. First time on the show. I had a blast.
This will not be the last, Douglas. This was great. Good. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.